Welcome to our 12th segment of the Constitution and American Life, coming to you from the Midwest and the Pacific Coast. I'm sorry, something popped up on my screen simultaneous to Kavanaugh leaving. Anyway, coming to you live to tape from the Midwest and the West Coast on this beautiful 1st of November. I have known these gentlemen collectively for 75 years. I did the math today, and it could be a margin of error there. And I admire, and what I most admire about the three of these individuals is that they are risk takers, for one, and they are tellers of funny stories. We have Professor Williams from the University of San Diego here, whose greatest risk in life was playing quarterback in his high school with an offensive line that averaged 5'9", 165 pounds. Think about it. We also have Professor Moore, who, if you get a chance, you need to talk to him about why his face and his voice was all over news stations across the West having to deal with an incident at an airport. Now, I'm not going to tell the story, so maybe you can contact him and find out what happened at an airport one time that led to almost national coverage. And we have with us Professor Kavanaugh, whose greatest risk was actually walking down the streets near Indiana University, all right, the great IU in Bloomington, Indiana. As Professor Moore made astute comments to IU students that they appreciated greatly, Mr. Kavanaugh was part of that. He could probably tell you that story. And I am David Richmond here from the Central Valley of California. I was known for many, many years as the Mickey Mouse teacher because of my appearance on the Disney Channel's American Teacher Award. So kids would walk in with, mouse ears all the time. Well, not all the time, for a few years. Today, we are going to be discussing the amendment process and other avenues for interpreting the Constitution. We will be addressing a quote from George Mason. I'd like to read that quote for you right now. He noted that it will be better to provide for them in an easy, regular, and constitutional way, speaking about the amendment process, than to trust to chance and violence. We're going to dig in a little bit deeper to that. But I was doing a lot of reading this weekend on the amendment process, and I found it interesting that we seem to have a pattern regarding this amendment process. And obviously there's a sequence to it, there's a chronological, but I found, I think, a little bit more sophisticated sequence, if you want to call it that, if you will. I noticed that we have 5 distinct periods of amending. Period 1 is the framing period, in which we get obviously the Bill of Rights, and then we get the 11th and 12th Amendment. Period 2 is the Reconstruction period, where we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Period 3 is the Progressive period, where we get the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendment. Period 4 is the New Deal, I'll call it second Progressive period, in which we get, and I'm having a brain fart and I lost my spot, but we get a couple amendments. I think it's the 20th and 21st amendments, if I'm correct. Period 5 is we get the civil rights period there, and we get a number of amendments. And then there are some outliers. Obviously, the 22nd Amendment, I think it's in 1951, kind of between the New Deal and civil rights period. And then we get the 27th Amendment, which is probably one of the most obscure and I don't know if it's interesting or useless amendments in some ways that we have. On average, again, working my mathematical ability, which we love to do here on the 4Bs so much, on average, it's about 30 years between these periods, on average. So let's make sure we're clear about that. So if indeed my analysis and insight says that there is a sequence and there is a general period of time, there's a pattern here. We have gone way beyond the period in which this generation is responsible for amending the Constitution. because the last amendment, barring the 27th, which was a very strange situation, was 1971, and it's 2021. And I want you to think about that as we move through our conversation. And so I would like to start our discussion here with Professor Moore and go back to the quote by George Mason. I read the whole quote, but what I'd like to deal with, because I was a little bit fuzzy on this, is what did Mason mean by ... than to trust by chance and violence?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Often, I think when the folks that write these questions get down to using quotes, sometimes you just don't have the space to put the full quote in, so they get truncated, and sometimes, to your point, David, something gets lost in the dots. I would say that what Mason is fearful of, and other folks at the convention when they talked about the amendment process, and then in ratification too, it comes up. They're concerned about, it seems to me, two things. One, the inability of the articles to be amended. But which leads to the second fear is if you have a system that is so impossible to change, what are people left with? And these are the folks that are hot off the experience of things like populist frustrations in the 1780s. So they're fearful of bloodshed as a way to redo or reform or alter a constitution. So I think those two things play heavily into the discussions at Philadelphia. And the bloodshed issue comes up in the ratification too. One of the great Federalists in North Carolina, James Ardell, in a speech indicated the same thing. He thinks that the convention has the Goldilocks spot. It's just right. Not too easy, not too difficult. And in his logic at the convention in North Carolina, he says, and this ultimately prevents bloodshed in revising constitutional systems. So I think that's the backdrop that is at Philadelphia, and also a little bit in the ratification debates.
Well, was there any significant debate about amendments, Professor Moore? What I'm sensing from you is that there seemed to be a general consensus, and this wasn't one of the heated
topics. No, there's not. No, when you compare it to executive powers and representation, no, there's not a lot in Madison's notes, assuming that he took the notes properly. I mean, the only things that pop up after a committee kind of distills out a bunch of stuff that was done. The committee of detail comes back, and then they add a few things. And then very late in the convention, they add into Article 5 the caveats of, okay, but you can't have an amendment on slavery until 1808, and you can't have an amendment altering representation in the Senate. Those were very late additions. Before that, largely it was a discussion about should the national legislature be involved, or just state legislatures, or a combination thereof.
Well, to Professor Kavanaugh, I'm curious, and this will include anyone who wants to jump in. Were there any antecedents to this? I mean, was there anything to build on as far as an amendment process? And I'll be honest, I should know more about the British system. Since it's an unwritten constitution, I would assume there is no formal amendment process. So are there any antecedents to this situation?
I think Tim just addressed that, because under the articles, and I think most of the students will know when they start discussing the pros and cons of the articles, one of the biggest cons of the Articles of Confederation was the inability to ratify any proposed amendments. I mean, there were numerous proposed amendments under the articles, but with the unanimity being required, obviously there was none that got through.
Well, let me ask it differently. You're right. Tim addressed that as far as the articles, but obviously, writing and getting to the articles, is there any antecedent to that? I mean,
yes.
I guess that's what I'm wondering, because they made it unanimous in the articles. They had to have all 13 states or whatever participate. Right. So what led them to that?
To unanimity?
Yeah.
Well, I think the legacy of state sovereignty would be the easy answer there. You can't, when you look at the founding period, you can't get around this idea of states believing themselves to be sovereign. Um, there was an interesting thing that Vermont did uh, when they wrote their constitution. They created a council, and this council, I think their terms were 5 years. What they could do is, if they if they could look at laws and recommend legislatures to change laws, but they could also call just this. I think there were like a dozen members on this council. They could actually call for a convention in Vermont, 13 people, if they felt their constitution needed to be addressed and the legislature didn't do it. So talk about an elitist amendment, which is kind of unusual for Vermont, because they prided themselves in being kind of rugged individualists and almost anti-institutional. So Vermont had this really, it was an outlier of how to amend their constitution. A committee of 13 could call for a convention.
Was it, if it was ever used?
I don't know that. That's a good question. That might be something, like if students are going to quote the Vermont cite Vermont, they probably ought to look into that. I don't know. I mean, Pennsylvania has a similar thing with their council of censors. Every 7 years they'd meet and reconsider stuff that the legislature had passed. So
I was wondering how similar that was to Madison's proposed Council of Revision.
Well, I mean, arguably, I mean, that gets booted early in the summer. But again, that if that would have held true, I mean, you'd have to have a crystal ball on this. If the Council of Revision would have held true, would Article 5 sound the way it actually did? I don't know, because as we all know, they're not debating these clauses in isolation. So when when the Supremacy Clause comes around, and the Necessary and Proper Clause come around, that influences people to think, oh, we need an 1808 clause, because Southerners are very sensitive to, would the National Congress promulgate, there's our word for the week maybe, would they promulgate an amendment abolishing slavery? So all of these things are going on in tandem as they develop what eventually would become Article 5.
So, Professor Williams, and we proudly proclaim this, that we're a nation founded in revolution. A revolution, obviously, in my mind, expresses a nation moving forward, a radical change that's moving forward. But the amendment process, given how difficult it is, and given the weight that the minority plays here, 2/3, 3/4 kind of stuff. Is the amendment process counter-revolutionary, in your opinion?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd use that phrase. It's going to make any sort of changes more difficult. And as Tim and Chris has already said, that was done on purpose, right? I mean, we're trying to, at that period, find this perfect balance, or this balance between being able to change the document, but also wanting that stability. What I think is interesting, I mean, and I know we're going to maybe talk about alternatives later, so I'm not going to go there yet. But if you just look at our amendment difficulty, I mean, it is the most difficult constitution in the world to amend, simply because of the two-step process, right? And the supermajorities needed with each one. But I was reading something getting ready for our talk, and I'll share this with the students in the notes at the end. There's a project called the Comparative Constitutions Project, and they have a lot of great articles. There's just one article where these scholars are talking about, it's not just the amendment rules that matter, but they call it the amendment culture. And they try to get at like what it looks like to measure an amendment culture. And one of their ideas is just around this idea of sacredness. So I just wanted to like throw this into the mix, because I think, I don't know if this was intentional on everyone who had a hand in writing the Constitution, but given that it's been so difficult to amend, there is, I think, even the fact that we are on a program talking about the We the People curriculum, right? There is a certain sort of sacredness that we hold our Constitution up to, and that culture, these scholars would argue, definitely makes that counter-revolutionary statement that you made. That may be where it's coming from. It may be just like that we think of the Constitution as something that needs to be stable and you don't want to mess with it because you're going to be messing with the very foundations. That may be more important than the rules, right? I mean, there are countries that have rules similar to ours with super majorities, and they amend the Constitution a lot more. So I think thinking about what the Constitution means in a cultural sense is something that maybe taps in a little more to your counter-revolutionary idea.
Well, there's one, there's a great piece of work on, on the 18th century, the radicalism of the American Revolution there. And it seems to me that maybe the revolution is radical, possibly, Professor Wood, it is, but we get to the Constitution, and it seems to me that by this time the conservatives have taken over. So at minimal, I'll change from from counter-revolutionary to conservative, in the sense that the amendment process makes it. And again, I think the fact that we've only had 17 changes since 1791 confirms that. So at minimum, this is a very conservative constitutional order. Would you agree with that, Professor Williams?
Yeah, I definitely would. I think that I think for the most part, political elites, when they get a system where they can have power, they're going to want to try to keep that system in place. But I think you're onto something. I mean, your note about the 17, South Africa has had 17 amendments to their constitution since 1996. So it's definitely a conservative document, a conservative process.
Go ahead.
Well, I think for me, it's always like, what's the baseline of whether it's radical or conservative? I mean, Chris pointed out rightfully that there were half a dozen attempts to amend the articles, and Rhode Island kind of blows it up most of the time. 2 of the 6 on the impost. So there's this I guess I look at the articles as being radical in one sense because it's an impossible standard. It's conservative in the sense that it's totally consistent with the notion of state sovereignty. And then Madison says something interesting. I think it's Federalist 43. He's making the argument that we did, he said at the convention, they must have, like he's ignorant. But he makes the argument that it's perfect because I think the quote is something like, there's a residual palladium of state sovereignty in the amendment process. And to your point, that is really a wonderful conservative statement. We're preserving this notion, some notion, or just enough residual idea of state sovereignty because states are involved in the amendment process. So I think it is kind of conservative. Is it counter-revolutionary? I think the whole Constitution might be considered that, let alone Article 5.
Professor Kavanaugh, you were given a thumbs up.
Well, that's I thought your question to Mike was an awesome question, but I would say the Constitution itself is counter-revolutionary. I think the articles itself, maintaining the state sovereignty, was carrying forward those radical ideas, perhaps of the Professor Wood was talking about, right? And what you had mentioned, David. But I think that you see the backlash to Shays' Rebellion, among other things, coming through in the Constitution itself. So I think it's a way to counter the outbreak of democracy, so to speak. That's why I think that you might consider the Constitution itself counter-revolutionary.
Well, also, I mean, Professor Moore, you talk about state sovereignty, but there's also this notion of popular sovereignty, and I guess that's the angle I'm coming from, because I understand the state sovereignty, but on the popular sovereignty notion, this seems to undermine any idea of majoritarian. I mean, it's super majoritarian democracy.
That came up in a lot of the state ratifying conventions. In fact, Patrick Henry as usual, makes a very long-winded argument that, hey, where are the people in this Article 5? He's very distrustful of a corrupt, elitist national government being involved in this. He cites the British bribery and corruption problem if the national legislature is going to be involved. And so he and others, I mean, Federal Farmer in one of a section, Federal Farmer, makes a similar argument that there should be popular input into this, not just legislative bodies. And then, okay, does the convention route in the states equal popular sovereignty? A lot of anti-federalists didn't believe that would be the case, that there'd be popular input.
And I'm going to push back a little bit on the supermajority idea, right? Certainly, when you look at what is it, 3/5 of the states? Is that what we're talking about here in Article 5, right? Is it
3/4? Well, depending on which way it goes.
3/4.
Yeah.
Which actually today, and I'm not trying to take me back to my usual rant, but you can amend the Constitution with less than 50% of the population. So if you get the right number of states together, and you get 3/4 of the states, which will still be the minority of people. So there is a process for that.
You're a good anti-federalist in that regard, Chris.
And your homework assignment is to come up with the amendment and then the mathematical, formula of which states would have to do this and what amendment would bind those states together.
I don't have an amendment. I just have math. So I just.
Well, I agree, but again, we've said this for many months now. The possibility of this, but I'd like to see an amendment that could draw those exact number of states to do that. I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime, but quite possibly. And so
I think that's a project for the.
Go ahead, Mike.
I'm just gonna say I think that's a project for the students more than for Chris. I think that'd be a really good argument to kind of weave together. So yeah.
So they should, could they come up with an amendment in which they believe they could get the right states in which, what did you say it would take less than 50% of the people, but it would be 3/4 of the states.
Right.
All right. So that's your homework assignment, students. Please send that to Dr. Mike Williams at the University of San Diego, and he'll give you feedback on that. Professor Kavanaugh, we're in our next session going to be talking in depth about judicial review, but I am curious as to what you would identify, because the kids are kind of being asked to go down this path. What you would identify as a Supreme Court case. All right. So beyond amendments, there are obviously other institutions that we have that have interpretive power, that in fact may have amendment power through that interpretive or legislative power that they are given. So I'm curious, since you're our Supreme Court case guru, can you identify a case historically, all right, the entire history, that you believe significantly altered the understanding / interpretation of the Constitution? That would qualify, would be equal to, quite possibly, an amendment.
Well, I think I always like to think about not one case, but think about Plessy to Brown, right? If you think about Plessy 1896, Brown 1954, we have no new amendments. We have no new laws. We have the same amendments and the same laws in place in terms of, well, especially the 14th Amendment. And what do you have? And to help me with that's 58 years. Nothing changes other than the Supreme Court opinion in the case. You can go from Bowers v. Hardwick to Lawrence v. Texas. The time frame shrinks. And then you go to, you end up in Obergefell. So, and we have no new laws or no new amendments, but what we have are Supreme Court interpretations as we as a society have changed. And you see that reflected in those opinions. So there might be the argument that an amendment was not needed. we simply need to live up to the wording of the 14th Amendment, perhaps.
Well, I propose McCullough. Given the fact that the Jeffersonians are so livid with Marshall in that decision, I mean, they see Marshall as actually this is an unconstitutional interpretation, but the rhetoric is such that it borders on the he has amended through judicial fiat the meaning of commerce and federalism, for that matter. And then I think the other standard answer, if you want to believe that Marbury v. Madison could fit in this category of amending. I mean, it's just I would stop short of saying amendment, but the effect of how things work, I think McCullough and maybe Marbury and how Marbury's been interpreted could fit in this category.
Well, I put Gibbons, and it's, those early federal commerce kind of, and there's a package deal. There's Gibbons, there's McCullough,
Dartmouth. Fletcher versus Peck. Yeah.
To me, collectively, they have the effect of an amendment in the sense of clarifying as best as possible in the 19th century. Marbury, I'll push back on that, Professor Moore. Marbury.
Well, I don't believe that. I personally don't believe that, but I know a lot of people do. So
okay, well, let's see, and that's my problem. Marbury already affirms what is already known because they've already exercised judicial review, before Marbury. I guess if there's a significance or radicalism of Marbury, it's the first time that the court told Congress, no, you can't do that. But I don't know if it has, the rumbles of an amendment process. But that's just me pushing back. Yeah, Professor Williams.
I would just add to the mix and kind of building on what Chris added. The students take a look at Caroline Products, footnote 4, right? Which kind of it's a signal to the legal community that they're going to start interpreting the 14th Amendment as a way to protect individual rights rather than property rights. And I don't know if we get from Plessy to Brown without that footnote doing some of that work. And it's an interesting, like, the 14th Amendment was this important amendment. Then there was a interpretation of that, as the students may know, like after the Civil War. And this case kind of offers a reinterpretation of that interpretation, which kind of opens it up to new ideas.
So what do you think about Gitlow as far as incorporation having the seismic effect of an amendment? Anyone agree with me on that Gitlow would possibly be one of those?
Actually, I would say the counter to that would be Barron v. Baltimore, because I think Barron v. Baltimore actually, simply because I think if you ask the framers of the 14th Amendment, which we can't, but we can go back and look at some of their writings, they believed that the other amendments would be naturally incorporated as a protection against state governments, right? And I think the Cruikshank decision, if you take a look at that, but so I think it took Gitlow, David. My point was it took Gitlow to actually begin that process of selective incorporation, but Barron v. Baltimore might be more powerful in the fact that it stopped what the framers of the 14th thought was going to happen, and that was.
Well, wait, help me out, Chris. Isn't it Barron in the 1830s?
Yeah,
1832.
So it couldn't stop the 14th Amendment because the 14th Amendment hadn't been ratified yet.
Well, that the whole idea. Yeah, your point. Sorry, that the Bill of Rights only protects you from the national government, right?
Yeah, and so in that sense, I see Barron kind of as I see the commerce cases of kind of affirming this federal relationship in this area, in this area of rights. Like I said, I'm postulating that maybe Gitlow might be, because it begins the ball rolling, right? As far as the incorporation.
I got myself out of order, but I do believe that when people are looking at the idea of incorporation, they go back to Barron and say, well, yes, this, as Marshall has said, so therefore these amendments, they're not going to be incorporated. And it takes Gitlow in 1925 to incorporate, to open the door, so to speak.
Well, I mean, if we're headed down that road, and I think that's fair for students to think about. I think if you want to think about how the court semi amends the Constitution, they delete the privilege and immunities clause in the slaughterhouse cases. So maybe there's another one of those amendments by we're not even going to talk about, or we're going to eviscerate a part of the Constitution. Now that's certainly not, I don't know if that's amending the Constitution, but it's certainly saying it's null and void.
And I'll tell you, go ahead, Chris.
No, I think that's a great point for students to consider.
Yeah, and I will tell you that in our journeys, you know, in the studies of the Constitution, especially through the We the People program, that has got to be the most frustrating area or topic, because the myriad of wonderful law professors and historians that we've been able to meet and talk to over the years, because of our association with this program, I have yet to get an answer by any scholar to explain why slaughterhouse, all right, became this precedent in which the court would not touch until, like, what, 1999, 2000, they dabbled around with it. Why was it so sacred? And it was so abusively in opposition of what the framers of the 14th Amendment wanted from the Privileges and Immunities Clause. It's still a mystery to me of why that happened. Yeah,
it
Chris?
was white butchers. It wasn't blacks. It was white butchers.
Was that what you were going to say, Chris?
Well, I think there's a racial component to it, because when you start invoking privileges and immunities like the right to travel, the right to marry, right, certain things that are fundamental privileges or immunities possessed by people within states, right? Now the state government is infringing upon my right to say, oh, I don't know, vote, or maybe marry a person that doesn't look like me. Thank God. Is that, you know, that, yeah, thanks. You guys are a little slow on the uptake there, but that's okay.
No, there's a time delay.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah. So I think that's why there's a hesitancy. And I always go to Justice Thomas's concurring opinion in McDonald v. Chicago. He actually cites privileges and immunities, and in a footnote, he says, but I understand making this argument would open the door for other rights claims. And this is about the same time the same-sex marriage was coming up. So I think they're fearful to go back and correct that mistake in the slaughterhouse cases, because they know that it's going to open up a lot of rights claims of certain, well, we'll say insular minorities, to go back to Mike's point from Carolyn Products, against rights violations at the state level.
That's wonderful, Chris. And I just want to point out to the students, because it kind of comes back to Dave's question about the amendment process being counter-revolutionary, because it seems to me like we've already kind of documented it's really hard to change our Constitution. So we have this bloody Civil War, and we finally changed the Constitution. Like, it's like we've debated whether it's the second founding or whatever. We've had that discussion on here, and then before the ink is barely dry, we have this interpretation of that amendment that stops it in its tracks. So to me, it's, again, I mentioned the importance of culture, and the amendment, to Chris's point, the importance of politics, and to Tim's point, the importance of race, right? All those things, amendments aren't in this vacuum, right? And the justices and judges who interpret are not in a vacuum, and all those things kind of matter. And there I see that decision, Slaughterhouse, probably representing, unfortunately, where a majority of the country's beliefs were on how far they wanted the 14th Amendment to actually change our politics. Yeah.
So Tim, and again, I'd like all of you, if you could, to comment, but we know that Jefferson had a different view of the separation of powers doctrine and I guess interpretation than others did, in the sense that he thought that each branch should be able to independently interpret the law there. First off, I'm just curious, historically, kind of how you feel about that, and why you think that Jefferson's views didn't take hold per se. And we'll start there. So, if you
Well, I
talk
think,
about that tension
yeah.
between Jefferson's view and other views.
Well, I think when you're talking about Jefferson's view, that statement and coordinate review, you always have to factor into his absolute disdain of John Marshall. And Marshall's making all these decisions in the early republic, and Jefferson is just apoplectic about it because that Marshall's making the argument that it's a constitution that we've been given to interpret. So his animus towards his cousin, his distant cousin, is one thing. I also think a part of it may have to do with the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, students, if you look into this, he was, amongst his advisors, there was a lot of discussion about whether he could actually do this. And his original position was, no, I can't unless we have an amendment to the Constitution. Well, he goes ahead and he purchases, Louisiana, and then we'll put lipstick on the pig later. There's a lot of opposition to the Louisiana Purchase in New England. So I think some of his coordinate review views are driven by his animus towards Marshall, but also it may be a little bit CYA on what he'd done in the Louisiana Purchase. So I think there's an element there to consider. There's a great book by Larry Kramer. I think he's actually a Cal law professor on this coordinate review concept. I think it's called All the People by the People Themselves or something like that. It's a great book, to your point, David, outlining that argument, how it played out in early American history.
Hey, Tim, could you give the students a quick definition of what you mean by coordinate review?
It's not just the courts that interpret the Constitution, that each branch kind of does its own interpretation. And I don't know, maybe for the group here to consider, does the executive amend the Constitution through executive orders? Does the existence of administrative agencies, when they create write regulations, are they amending the Constitution? I mean, they always put in the legislature and the preambles to laws always states the constitutional basis for their action to do something, and some of them are actually kind of fig leaves. In if you look at them, they're interpreting the Constitution when they write pieces of legislation, and they try to explain where in the Constitution they get the authority to do stuff. So I think there's all kinds of examples where other branches may be doing interpreting more so than we want to acknowledge.
And I think
go ahead, Chris.
I think the students, in their text, you'll talk about executive agencies, and executive agencies being possessing of quasi-legislative as well as quasi-judicial power, right?
Yeah.
So, where does the EPA get some of its authority to write some of the legislation, or write the rules that are not legislation, but rules that they do, and then in terms of how they get to enforce those and decide that. And I know that the Supreme Court just agreed to pick up that case that challenged to some of the EPA authority. So something for the students to note.
Well, just to show to the audience just how in sync we are, is that was the next thing I was going to go to, and I guess I'd like you guys to, if you have any, really tangible examples of where the other branches, the court we've talked about, and we're going to go in more depth in our next session on the court. And we've given, I wrote down 8 or 9 examples of how the court may have made decisions that would be the equivalent in some degree to an amendment. But what about the legislative and executive departments? Can you give some tangible and ripe examples anytime in history where you think one or the other has taken action that you would put maybe not at the core of an amendment, but in the penumbras of the amendment process? And I think Professor Moore has helped us out with executive orders there, although I'm trying to think of an executive order that would rise to that level there. And I know that Professor Williams will definitely go to the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 there. But if you guys, each of you could like executive, legislative, where they're creating penumbras of amendments. There's Richmond's contribution to the academic penumbras of amendments.
Well, I can give you a couple. This is all 20th century stuff, so again, I'm on squishy ground. But the act that created NASA, Congress, it's just you read the preamble, and they're talking about military powers and their commercial powers, and so they cite various places in the Constitution that gives them the authority to create NASA. They do the same thing when they create the SEC. They do the same thing when they created the Federal Communications Commission. These preambles are just fascinating. A lot of times people go to the details of the law, but if you look at the preambles, they literally are interpreting the Constitution in a certain way that allows them to pass this legislation. And I think it's, to me, it's an honest debate about whether you can read them with a straight face or not. Whether the legislature is making a decent argument that they're interpreting the Constitution right and passing these laws. So, I mean, those are just a couple examples that come to my mind where the legislature might be doing this.
I like those. Those are great. Chris?
I always want someone to explain to me how President Nixon created the EPA. Because, I mean, that was some chicanery there. I don't know, but...
well, it seems to me that Tim says read the preamble.
Well, I probably need to go back and read the preamble, but I don't know if I understand my history, and I probably don't. I think Nixon kind of did that without a lot of legislative support, so I'm gonna have to go back and take a look at that. I would offer one, the Congress, the AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force, whether it be going back to maybe the Gulf of Tonkin resolution or the more modern one that Congress passed after 9/11. That holy cow. You talk about a broad expanse of executive power under a very nebulous document. You've given this is a Congress giving the president an immense amount of authority in terms of foreign policy. So I think that's one I would have the students take a look at in terms of shifting that balance of power, especially the war-making power, the war-declaring power. I mean, it was Madison himself that said Congress has the power to commence, conduct, and conclude war. And if you ask people that today, they're saying, no way, it's all executive power, because Congress will pass a resolution and like the authorization for the use of military force, which is gives the president broad power.
Yeah.
Chris, I want to ask you, do you think Washington then was interpreting the Constitution when he issued the Neutrality Act? Might that be an executive action that bordered on interpreting Constitution?
Well, I think so. I think if you ask Madison, right, the idea that the executive can unilaterally withdraw us from a treaty, right? I think so. When he's able to do that, I think this actually goes back to the Pacificus Helvidius debates of one of the Madison and Hamilton, in terms of Madison would be, well, wait a minute, the Senate has to be involved in this because the Senate confirms this treaty. So the idea that the executive can move us out of it without the Senate is a non-starter to him. So that's a good point. That's a good historical point.
Mike, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I think those are all great examples. I just kept thinking of the unitary theory of the executive.
Oh yeah.
As a really powerful interpretive mechanisms that presidents have used to get all this power we're talking about. And then I was thinking about Congress's response. This is not sequential, by the way, students, because we really see unified theory kind of really come alive during President Bush's term. Anyways, the War Powers Act, it seems to me is like a super interesting act of Congress, right? Because they're trying to say, look, we understand that the whole thing that's in the Constitution, this declaration of war that we're supposed to do, like we're supposed to declare it, that's not really working out. So we're going to pass this law, basically like for you, the president, to do this, and then, we don't feel so bad about it. But every president has kind of said, nope, I'm not following that resolution anyways, right? So it seems like it's a kind of a workaround that hasn't really happened. But that act in of itself, I think, is a super interesting example of that.
Well,
So
the,
go ahead,
no,
Chris.
no one's ever, I mean, in terms of the War Powers Act, I mean, what a useless piece of legislation. Congress believing they're taking some of their power back from the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, but as Mike points out, that liberals don't like it because they believe it actually gives a president power he shouldn't have, and conservatives don't like it because they believe it's taking power from the president that they should have. But presidents ever since then have violated it, and no one's done anything. So I think the only time that I heard somebody get upset was Dennis Kucinich, the congressman from Ohio, who was pretty liberal, was questioning Obama's ability to drone strikes in Libya, and he's the one going, "Hey, this is a violation of the War Powers Act,"
Yeah.
and people are going, "Oh, Dennis, sit down, be quiet. We don't want to hear it." So.
Well, one thing as far as on the executive side, because I thought Professor Moore and Kavanaugh did a really good job with a lot of legislation that may be within the penumbra of the amendment impact there. But I want to think, I think about Truman's executive order on desegregation of the military. And earlier we mentioned Brown and we mentioned all these civil rights things. And I'm just wondering, to what degree, how significant that was in kind of opening the door to those other changes there. And I know it had profound impact in the South, because suddenly, white and black are going to be commingling on military bases. And what's really interesting, in the communities in which those military bases were established, there was not going to be desegregation. And so the tension that arose from that is, and the resistance to some degree within the military to that. So I do wonder about that action. Mr. Moore, you look like you have a thought or a
yeah,
question.
I wonder constitutionally whether that executive, that would seem to be something in Article 1, Section 8, that Congress, with all of their military oversight that they have, it would seem that maybe Congress should have been the entity to do that. So it's an interesting thing constitutionally, that executive order. Is it interpreting the Constitution? I'll leave that to the modern historians to debate. But
Well, he is the commander in chief. So let's.
No.
well, no. Go ahead, Chris.
We're going to hold that for our discussion on the executive later on. I had to throw that out, and that'll be a good discussion there. But time is always our enemy in life. So, Professor Kavanaugh, I am curious. Is the only way, because the kids are asked to come up with changes, reforms to the amendment process, and of course, when I saw this topic, I started laughing, in the way that I do. So, is the only way to alter the amendment process is to create an amendment?
No, I don't think so. I think we've already.
Okay. Let's expand a little bit there, Professor.
No, not really. No, I mean, I think we've just given tons of examples of how the Constitution has changed without an amendment.
But my question is, we're going to deal with the amendment process.
Okay,
so that's our target.
Right.
Can we do that legislatively? Could we do that through executive action, or is the only way through the amendment process?
To change the wording, to actually change the wording you would find within Article 5, yes, you would need, I suppose, you would. This is kind of like a who's on first question. You would need an amendment to amend Article 5, because if you're actually talking about changing the text, not the interpretation of the text, but changing the text itself. So, yes.
Or a whole new convention, which in the ratification era,
that's in Article 5.
Well, but they wouldn't necessarily have to be limited to the text of the current Constitution, is my point. They could come up with a whole new one. And that was the fear of a lot of the Federalists, because there was a movement afoot to have, and even Randolph proposed that, let's have a second, let's have all the states have at it. at the Constitution, and then let's send that to another constitutional convention to look at the state recommendations. So who knows what that would have wound up if Randolph's idea would have been carried out. But you could have a whole new convention and they wouldn't be bound by anything in the constitutional text.
Yeah, and I apologize, Professor Kavanaugh. I did ask you kind of who's on first question because I really want to, and I'm fixated on this at this point in my life, is that so many of the issues we're dealing with take amendments. And we've just spent some time talking about how the amendment process, as structured and designed by the framers, is somewhat prohibitive to the changes that are possibly needed at various times in history. So I live in La La Land, according to Professor Moore, La La Land there. So Professor Williams, if you could, all right, garner Professor Kavanaugh's magical state numbers to get an amendment to the United States Constitution on the amendment process, how would you amend it?
Yeah, I think if I could get those numbers, maybe there's a way to do that without even a majority of the citizens. We'd have to think about that, right? No. Look, I think, kind of preparing for this discussion and looking at what some other countries do on this, I would want a process that made it a little easier. The numbers should be a little less demanding. Maybe a supermajority is fair, but maybe not quite the supermajority we're allowing. But then I would have a lot of countries require like a super majority for the provisions that they think are really, really important. Like, for example, some countries will say, okay, it's a 2/3 to amend the Constitution, but if you're going to amend anything in the Bill of Rights, that's 75% instead of 66, right? So it's a different number. Some countries just say there are some things that are not amendable. For example, you can't have India has this process where they say, we can't amend that the Constitution is supreme. You can't amend separation of powers. They even have judicial review because there was a fear that there was going to be a constitutional amendment to get rid of judicial review. So they kind of highlight those things that are either not touchable or that you really would want to have a higher standard, and then open it up for other things, the more sort of maybe technical or maybe things that deal with like power sharing. You open it up to make it a little easier. The fear I have with a convention is, to Tim's point, like imagining this, if we have another convention, everything is going to be on the table. And that kind of worries me as a citizen. I'd feel much better if I knew some of our founding values were really protected, and the current process is just not going to be the case. And that worries me.
Well, that shocks me coming from you. Founding values being protected. Professor Kavanaugh.
Well, listening to Mike reminded me a few years back, I had been doing some stuff over the summer and I got home and I got a message from my congressman. One of his staffers wanted to talk to me because they knew I was involved in this program and that kind of thing. And they're talking about this balanced budget amendment, right? About calling an Article 5 convention to get a balanced budget. And I think there are students that are watching this. You might want to see how many states have signed on to this, right? About an Article 5 convention to merely pass a balanced budget amendment. And he asked me about it. I said, well, that's all well and good, but if you have a convention, everything's on the table. And he said, no, we're going to make it so their people that attend are very limited in what they can talk about. And and I'm trying to remember this, if they go beyond the scope of their instructions, that we might have heard this before, going back to 1787, but if they go beyond the scope of their instructions, we will actually pull the delegate and send another delegate to this convention, so that somehow the state legislatures could hold the delegate in contempt of his or her instructions for focusing on something. I threw out the thing. I said, they could be talking about term limits at this convention. And he's like, oh, no. And I'd say, well, if it's on the table, it's on the table, right? Or anything could be on the table. So it's interesting. Students might want to look into that balanced budget Article 5 movement that's afoot. How many states have signed on to it?
Hey, Professor Moore, you get to wrap us up.
No,
No
I
recommendations?
I thought I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued by Mike's proposal, and actually, Mike, didn't South Africa in their Bill of Rights do something similar, that certain rights could never be messed with, and there were lesser. I remember there was a chart in the South African Bill of Rights that it did this. I think.
Yeah, no, what they've done is, and this is where I was borrowing it from, South Africa, you simply need a 2/3 vote of the parliament to amend the constitution. So that'd be like 267 out of the 400 seats. But if you propose anything that is going to change provincial powers, their states, or change the Bill of Rights, you then have to get 6 of the 9 provinces to agree with that. So they kind of have this, they have our process in terms of going back to the states, right? But only for these other things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, students, I'd like you to think about this. From 1789 to 2019, we've had 11,770 proposed amendments, and we have ratified 27. And so it seems to be a theme of ours. You do the math there, and I think that statistic in and of itself tells us how, in my opinion, undemocratic and counter-majoritarian we are as a country. And what I would propose, given technology and the change in culture, which Professor Williams has talked about a few times here, that if I had in La La Land the opportunity to change things, I would have the amendment process by a national referendum on a single day, and you need 60% of the vote, 60% of the popular vote. All right, and again, it would have to be proposed, and again, it's a little bit more complicated. But once we agree on a topic, 60% popular vote through a national referendum that could be vote by mail, or no, vote by text message or whatever.
Voting machines.
There, absolutely. So that's my recommendation for you to think about, and that way we can just bypass the Senate, would make Mr. Kavanaugh very happy in that sense. Hopefully you've gained some insights into the amendment process. And again, don't forget that number, 11,770 proposed, 27 ratified. Okay. We enjoyed having you today, and we look forward to our next discussion on judicial review. We have a special guest, one of the great professors of the Constitution, joining us in our next session. Until then, peace, love, you ever tacos? Bye-bye, bye-bye.